I'm Armando Carbonell. I chair the Department of Planning and Urban Form. It is always a pleasure to welcome you to our lecture series where we feed the mind and the body. And it's a special pleasure to be able to introduce an old friend, Jim O'Connell, who will be presenting the lecture today as arranged by Anthony Flint, our Public Affairs Director. I'm also told that it is possible to discreetly offer for sale, cash or check only, copies of Jim's book. And I wonder if this is discreet enough, just a little peeking out for the cameras. There are copies available out back. See Jim after the talk. He just autographed mine that I bought more or less at retail. And pleased to have it, and I recommend the book. I've known Jim for a long time. We crossed paths well more than 20 years ago on Cape Cod, where he came to work with me at the Cape Cod Commission as the first economic development officer of that organization, which was a statutory position, is to say, anytime anybody gave him a hard time, he said, "My job is required by law," and get out of my way. And he was an unusual hire because he came to us with a PhD in urban history from the University of Chicago. And one or two people asked, "Well, what's that have to do with economic development on Cape Cod?" And my answer, apart from his already having a distinguished career in economic development, was, we really didn't want the same old thing, and we got something different. But I see now that there was actually a different sort of fate in that. And that was simply we needed someone with a PhD in urban history from the University of Chicago so he could ultimately come to Boston and then Cambridge to talk about a book that's about the history of Metropolitan Boston, which I've been enjoying reading, and I think you will too. And Jim is here now in his current role as a planner for the National Park Service. He's taught at the Boston Architectural College. He's the author of other books, including a great book about Cape Cod that I could also recommend to you. But he's here in particular to talk about the hub's Metropolis, Boston from railroad suburb to smart growth.
Okay, great, thank you. I'd like to thank Armando very much for the kind introduction. I did work with him for almost 10 years at the Cape Cod Commission, and we had many discussions about regionalism. On Cape Cod, I think there's a pretty strong sense of regionalism, and if you've spent time there, you probably have a sense that it does have a strong sense of regionalism. And after spending 10 years of just being immersed in that, I moved to Boston in 2000, and said, okay, what's the sense of regionalism in Boston? I ended up looking at a number of places to live, suburbs, or maybe certain neighborhoods of Boston. I had a couple kids in school at the time. And I was trying to figure it out. I ended up living in Newton. And how does it all fit together? And being kind of a bookish guy, I was looking for a book or articles or different ways of looking at it. I came across fragments and bits and pieces, but it was always in my mind that, what was a good overview of how this metropolitan area came together? And I ended up doing a number of little projects. I have been working for the National Park Service for a while now, and I do have a day job, so these are little research things that I do on the side. And I did a couple little studies for the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, the Kennedy School, and looking at the history of regionalism or how it works or doesn't work here, and some other things on history. And as Armando pointed out, I am a historian by training and a planner by, 40 hours a week for a number of years now. So I bring that perspective when I do my work. And after doing all kinds of things and nosing around, after about 8 or 9 years, I figured, geez, I might have the raw material for a book, the book that I'd like to read about how Boston came together as a region. I'm going to, if you're interested in the book, afterwards it will be available. But just to show you, kind of an overview of what's in the book and how it's useful for me, and I think it would be useful for all kinds of people in this area, for helping them think about what this region is and how it came together. So just to kind of set the tone, geographically, what are we talking about? And I have a sense that we've got people here who know a lot about planning and cities and regions. And if you look at this map, it is kind of amazing. Kind of the inner yellow area and gray area is kind of more what I talk about in the book. That's the Metropolitan statistical area. And then if you look at the lighter gray, it goes out to be the consolidated Metropolitan statistical area, which makes it the 5th largest in population in the country for both area and for population. But I touch on that. I couldn't resist talking about Cape Cod a bit in the book, certainly southern New Hampshire. But basically what I talk about in the book is what's around the 495 Beltway inside of that, which is an area of, depending on how you want to count it, 3 to 4 million people. So that's kind of the area. It's kind of interesting. I'm involved in a little class tomorrow at the GSD on territorialism, and that there are lots of ways to think about regions. But I've got a particular perspective, and one that is coming from a historian's point of view. So that's the geography of it. And then the timeline. I think a lot of people think suburbia is something that happens after World War II, or it's something that happens in New Jersey, or something that happens in Southern California. But Boston, this stodgy old place, has been at the cutting edge of suburbanization for a couple centuries. So my book really starts around 1800, and all these little highlights I will be mentioning in a few moments. So how do you organize this? How do you put it together? And I guess being a historian, I'm always into periods and eras and phases, and I have broken it down into 10 different sections, different chapters, different eras. You'll see that in a moment. And it's kind of an approach to get a handle on this place, so that basically every community out to the 495 Beltway and beyond has landscapes that fit into these eras. And for each era, it has distinct characteristics for the built landscape, real estate development patterns, what kind of lots it has, transportation, modes of transportation, building types, housing styles, set up for retail, how that's handled, treatment of open and public space. And each of these eras does have different characteristics for that, which are often challenged in subsequent eras. So I'm going to go through this and give you a sense. This is a presentation on planning and development. And there are 2 types of planning that I talk about in each chapter. One is kind of conventional plans to build highways or railroads or streetcar lines, park systems or whatever. And then there's the vernacular, generic template that each era has that gets carried out not by municipalities, but by the private sector, the development community. What are the development types of that particular area? And I'm going to go through that. And for each of these chapters, each for these sections, I'm trying to make a book that's useful to planners and academics and students, but also to the general public. I do provide sites that people can see for each of these eras that are still notable, so they can go out and do their own exploration. I'm trying to give others a foundation, a launch pad to better explore this particular region. So here I am, traditional town centers, which really isn't suburbanization. And people may not realize this, but the Colonial town center was not really the town center that we know today. There was a meeting house, but the greens didn't amount to much. There weren't other institutions. It's only after the Revolution, after 1800, that the traditional New England town center develops, with the green and the meeting house, the schools, commercial buildings, wealthy people building their homes around it. And we have a number of communities around Boston, which do then form the core, the nucleus of suburbia. But not necessarily. Obviously, you've got these towns throughout New England. They aren't necessarily suburbs. Here we are, an example here, right here in Cambridge, back before we had automobiles and cars and buses and everything else going through Harvard Square and cutting up Cambridge Common. And then what I call proto-suburbs. A fellow named Henry Binford wrote a book on suburbs before the Civil War in Boston. And if you kind of take a look from 1800 to 1860, there's just kind of a lot of spilling out from Boston of various activities and urban functions that could no longer be taken care of in Boston. Kind of light industry, farming, dairying. Some of the activities that I particularly find interesting are the cattle markets. You've got one in Brighton, you've got one in Porter Square out here, where they just drive in the livestock, you drive it in on today's Mass Ave, bring it to Porter Square, and then they have the slaughter yards there. So all these different activities, which kind of this creeping suburbanization, but not the suburbia that we have today. So country retreats. This is really the beginning of it. Again, I started about 1820, but certainly you could go back into the 18th century, where you had wealthy, powerful people who had a home in Boston. Boston was pretty crammed, and it was ideal to move out to the countryside. And the countryside was right nearby. You didn't have to go far. Brookline, Cambridge was the countryside, certainly before the Civil War. They would have a home in downtown Boston, and then a second home in the country, which could be often farming, model horticulture, etc. Here we are, the Gardner's house, Isabella Stewart Gardner's family, Green Hill. Not that they were there in 1806, but they got there by the 1840s, and it wasn't necessarily her family, her husband's family. And it's right near the Olmsted House today. There's another example here. Again, take a look through Greater Boston, see these earlier layers. The Lyman Estate in Waltham, which is a property of, which one is it? Historic New England? Yeah. And then Belmont nearby. This is gone now, but this was built by a man named Cushing, wealthy merchant in 1840. Belmont didn't exist at the time. There was a bit of Watertown, a bit of Waltham, bit of what's today Arlington. They cut it off, they put it together in 1859, created Belmont, and it was called Belmont because Mr. Cushing put up the money to create this new community of Belmont. So just to go back to this, you've got all these, and I could give a whole talk just on this particular era. But it kind of sets a tone for people to think, middle-class people, whatever, to aspire. Gee, someday I'd like to have a place outside the city with some land or whatever, and kind of it gets people thinking about that, which then we move into the post-World War II era, and everybody wants their quarter acre or sixth of an acre in their backyard. And of course, you can extend this area here. I had 1920, certainly Weston, Lincoln, Dover. Those are communities that still have a lot of this sort of landscape. Now, railroad suburbs, I think this is certainly one of the most significant aspects of Greater Boston's development. In 1834, the first railway trip out from Boston left downtown, and it was going to be the Boston-Worcester line, but the first trip just ended in West Newton, and that was in 1834. It went on to Worcester subsequently. And actually, they built railroad lines for the next couple of years out to Providence and Newburyport and Lowell, whatever. And the system that we have today of commuter rail was really in place going back to the 1830s. And here we are. If you know West Newton, this is the Sweet Tomatoes Pizza Parlor, and this brick building here was the first railroad terminus in Boston's history. And it's interesting because Newton is this very early, you could call it the best example of a railroad suburb. Newton, being a Newtonite and a resident of Newtonville, Newton has this thing where it loves to call its neighborhoods villages. And people really, nobody calls it neighborhoods. It doesn't have one town center. It's got supposedly 13 of these villages. And it's very much created by each stop on the railroad. So here's an example here. The first, I don't think I have it in this presentation. The first residential subdivision off of a railroad line that I've been able to identify is in Brookline, 1843. But this is 1844. This is Walnut Park, Newton Corner. And if you know the Jackson Homestead, which is the home of the Newton Historical Society, it's a historic house. It's owned by Congressman, it was the home of Congressman Jackson, William Jackson. And he, back in 1834, got the railroad line to come through Newton. The planners wanted to put it on the north side of the Charles River through Watertown and Waltham, but they didn't really want it. And he said, geez, let's bring it through Newton. So if I might just step over here, this is the Boston, Worcester, whatever you want to call it, railroad line, which still exists. You can take the commuter rail in any day. Here's the Jackson Homestead, and here's how we subdivided it out back. He had Alexander Wadsworth, who was someone who helped plan a number of subdivisions and also helped lay out the Mount Auburn Cemetery. So this is 1844, and this is kind of interesting. When the railroads were started in the 1830s, everybody thought it was going to be for commercial freight. Or maybe some long distance travel. Nobody was thinking about suburbanization, but very quickly, people who were living in the city said, you mean I can live a half-hour train ride out of the city and live in a nice lot, an acre or whatever, and then commute in and be downtown? Hey, that's a great idea. And people started thinking about that during the 1830s, and by the early 1840s, they went to the railroad line and they said, gee, I'm riding this line every day. Can I get a discount on my ticket? And they said, okay, we'll issue a pass, a yearly pass, and we'll call it a commuted fare. So you'll be a commuter. Now everybody thinks today that a commuter is somebody driving on Route 128, but it's that discounted railroad fare that was introduced in the early 1840s, specifically to serve people like this living in today's Newton Corner. And here's Newton as a railroad suburb. You see all these little names, place names, and almost all of them are centers that were railroad stops in the mid-19th century and still are. Now, since we're at Cambridge, I thought I'd come up with here this I found at the Boston Public Library, and it's a wonderful little plan because it draws you in. It's a promotional piece. It isn't just to show the subdivision here on the right. This is today's Mass Ave. You can see diagonally cutting across. This is the railroad line, which is the Fitchburg line today. And they're developing this street with these lots right near the station, 1860. And I love the little picture here. It's this kind of sylvan place, today's Mass Ave out near Porter Square. You can see way in the far left distance, that's a horse-drawn streetcar coming along. And that's the image that they were trying to sell to people who were living crammed in, jammed in Boston to come out to the suburbs of Cambridge. And then I'm not going to say too much about Frederick Olmsted right here. He's going to be woven through my piece. He ended up moving in the early 1880s to Brookline. Was it because it was a railroad suburb? Was it because it was an estate suburb? It was a little of both. But while he was there, obviously he was designing the Emerald Necklace Parks and Parkways. But he did one subdivision plan. This is Fisher Hill, still exists in Brookline. And again, I'm going to point out the railroad line. This is the Riverside Green Line here, D line, stop here, Beaconsfield. He laid it out in 1884, and much of that subdivision is just as it is. It's kind of on a hill. It's got irregular lots. He was trying to catch the contours of the landscape, not just lay out a straight grid. It's kind of an interesting piece. And as you know, the work that he did in Riverside outside of Chicago, he was very interested not just in parks, but in suburban landscapes as well. So Brookline, we have to keep coming back to Brookline because this really sets the stage for a lot of what happens in planning throughout Greater Boston. You might realize that in the 1860s into the early 1870s, the city of Boston was annexing surrounding towns. They annexed you may not realize this, Charlestown was a separate municipality, Dorchester, Roxbury, West Roxbury, Brighton, and they all were happy to get involved because they would then take advantage of the infrastructure and all the facilities that were being created in this city. So they want to be part of it. Other surrounding communities were looking at it as well. Cambridge had a number of votes in the 1880s to join Boston. And Brookline had one, a very famous one in 1874. They had two more by 1880. You had middle-class people, working people in Brookline at town meeting who wanted to be part of Boston, who wanted the economic development that would come with it. But you had the wealthy people, primarily residing in today's South Brookline, in those estates, who didn't want to have anything to do with the city. They wanted to get out of the city. They wanted to get away from the immigrants, particularly the Irish political machine that was developing, and they didn't want to be part of Boston. And they had 3 votes to say, no, we don't. And the only annexation that took place subsequently was of Hyde Park in 1912. So where does that leave Boston? If you look at New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, etc., those cities were annexing right through the 19th century and are much bigger places geographically. Boston, in this metropolitan area that we're talking about, really remains pretty small and kind of forces Boston to make some different choices in terms of doing planning and development. Streetcar suburbs, I'm going to briefly go through this. I like to make the distinction between the horse car suburbs and the electric streetcar suburbs. As you'd realize, electric streetcars go a lot faster than horse-drawn streetcars. So the radius of the city of urbanization going out into these new developing streetcar suburbs is smaller going up to 1889 than afterwards. And the book that Sam Bass Warner wrote, Streetcar Suburbs, is more about the horse car drawn era and what happened. Here's a picture of a horse car. The first horse cars ran in 1856, started in Harvard Square and going to downtown Boston. You can see it on the side here, Harvard University, Cambridge, and Boston. Now, what really changes it, and again, I'm kind of going from the kind of vernacular development template to the planning idea, very important, significant figure who's not that well known in Boston, a man named Henry Whitney, who starts pulling together all the horse-drawn streetcar lines in the 1880s into one big conglomerate. Up until that point, every little town, little neighborhoods had their independent lines. He pulls it together into one big company, and then he's going to be interested in electrifying it. But his real interest is real estate. And he hires Frederick Law Olmsted, who was living in Brooklyn at the time, in 1886, to lay out today's Beacon Street. And on the right, you've got Com Ave, going back to today's Kenmore Square. And on the far left, you've got Cleveland Circle. And Beacon Street, or whatever, was kind of a country road. And Olmsted lays it out, and you can see it. This is, classic 1880s history right there today. It's got the streetcar line up the middle. This is laid out before the car had been invented, so they were thinking of horse-drawn traffic or bicycle traffic, perhaps. But what Whitney was interested in was the real estate. He bought up as much real estate as he could, and then he was looking to really make his killing on selling it to, he thought it would be to people for single-family homes. That happened briefly, but we know that if you go to Brookline, Beacon Street is lined pretty much by apartment buildings. Here you kind of see some apartment buildings on the left. You want to call that suburbia. It's pretty urban, but you could call it a version of streetcar suburbs. And then on the right, what is the more prevalent type of streetcar suburb are the 3-deckers. Here they are in Dorchester, but you can obviously find them in Cambridge, Somerville, and a whole bunch of communities, maybe 2-family homes as well, because you need this kind of density to take advantage of the streetcars. So you have this this density. This is this vernacular development template for this kind of suburb that I'm talking about. Here we are, Somerville. Great photos by Alex McLean, somebody who I was introduced to by Armando a number of years ago, and I used his material liberally in the book and in this presentation. Mill towns. This is why I didn't want to call this just a book about suburbia. I'm talking about it as a region, because you do have these mill towns that are sprinkled through the region, which back in the 19th century are pretty self-contained places. The workers there isn't a lot of transportation, they aren't moving around, they're working 6 days a week, they're in the town, that's it. It's self-contained. They don't have any time or money. Maybe they can go on the 4th of July to some outing, but basically they're in the town. So, here we are in Lowell, which, here we are. Lowell was laid out in 1825. Here it is 1876, a prodigious place. But, Waltham is an industrial place, and Brockton, and, you have Lynn, you just name those places. And while they were kind of self-contained in the 19th century, by the 20th century, particularly after World War II, the industry kind of goes away, and people begin to, move more freely with automobiles and highways to the region. They become much more knitted in, and semi-suburbanized with a whole bunch of other communities. So that's the planned communities. Then you have the unplanned industrial communities, and Cambridge is a fascinating example. I wish I could get into it a bit more here. Cambridge, Somerville, these communities north of Boston, going up to Everett, you know them. But Cambridge, right through World War II and beyond, was the third biggest industrial city in New England after Boston and Providence. A Ford Model T plant. I didn't know that was a Model T plant. Obviously Necco, but you name it, around Kendall Square or East Cambridge, the largest glass-making plant in the country, and ink, you name it, they made it, caskets, boilers, etc. But it was unplanned, and it was kind of this hybrid with this streetcar suburbs, if you will. Now, this is what I think is a particularly interesting phase of Boston's development, and which really distinguishes it, and which really grabbed me. When I was trying to buy a house in Boston, we were looking at different places. I was in Milton, for instance. I was in Blue Hills Parkway, saying, boy, this is a distinct kind of street. This is a distinct kind of landscape. How did this come about? And that's one of the areas that I really got into researching. And I don't think it's been pulled out as much, and that's what I've tried to do in the book, that this is a distinguishing feature of Boston. You can see the dates, 1893, right up to World War II. And these are the parks and parkways that were part of the MDC system and now DCR. If you take a look at this, it's a bit hard to read. You've got the Middlesex Fells up at the top, Blue Hills Reservation down below, Waverly Oaks in Belmont and Waltham. You've got the first public beach in America, Revere Beach in Nantasket. You've got, of course, the Charles River Basin. You've got all these parks, and then the key people who I really have to emphasize here, two influential planners, Olmsted, who didn't really plan it but inspired it, certainly with his Emerald Necklace parks and parkways, which were laid out in the 1880s, and Charles Eliot, the son of the Harvard president, who died all too young, was a protege and worker with Olmsted, who took Olmsted's ideas and projected it onto the region. And the amazing thing is that it's a great story how it comes. Basically what they have to do is that after Brookline, they had to work regionally. Individual cities and towns could not deal with the infrastructure issues. They had to create a Metropolitan Sewer Board in 1889 to serve places like Brookline, in Newton, in Cambridge. They had to create a water board to create a regional water system. That was 1895. And this park and parkway system in 1893. And this is the first example of regional planning, real regional planning in the United States. And Boston is not notable for regional planning today, but in the 1890s and early 1900s it was. Just let me give you a number or two that they achieved. In 7 years, from 1893, when the original plan was put out by Charles Eliot, the Metropolitan Park System conserved 91,000 acres of open space, 13 miles of oceanfront, 56 miles of riverbank, and built 7 parkways. Now, can you imagine doing something like that today? They just went out and built it. They got the money, and it's just one of the extraordinary achievements of Greater Boston. It really gives the shape to the communities basically inside the Route 128 Beltway. And I think makes for great urbanism and great built communities come out of that era. And here's a little map of the parkway circa 1945. Not the greatest map in the world. I'll help you out a bit. This is the Charles River, both sides, Memorial Drive, etc. This is the Emerald Necklace Parkway parkways that Olmsted designed. This gets you, up here going out to Revere Beach, Fresh Pond, etc. So it kind of gives you a sense of how these gave a real shape and allowed these communities to develop. And of course, these parkways were, when they were first started, the first car was in this country was built in Springfield in 1893, so nobody's thinking of cars. They were thinking of the streetcar lines. For instance, here you've got the Fells Way going up to Malden, and the streetcar line's out today, but it was there originally. You can see the development that came around it, and then cars were added later. You can see the Mystic River Parkway. This is before cars. You can see how it was being used in 1897. And I just wanted to add this. This is something that Armando and I used to talk about back in the day. The Bay Circuit Trail, kind of one of these ideas which, I'm going to show you a few big planning ideas which either did come to fruition or didn't. This was an idea from the 1920s. Benton Mackay, you may know, someone who came up with the idea to create the Appalachian Trail, and he had a lot of ideas about regional planning. And he had this idea to move out from, let's say, the Metropolitan ring that Charles Elliott had designed to go out another 10 miles. So today would be somewhere between where 128 is and 495. And the Depression came along, and then World War II, it didn't get funded, and then it was after World War II, and the suburbs didn't want to have any part of it. They just wanted to be natural, because he had a real idea almost to do kind of a parkway, but to have open space along it. And it was only stitched together in the last, Governor Dukakis back in the 80s really got it going. And it's kind of the stitched together area of some state park land, maybe Boy Scout reservations, conservation land, Mass Audubon, etc. But it's really intriguing, and if you're interested in a Sunday hike, as I've taken many times, it's a great walk. It's over 200 miles long. It might be kind of hard to do one thing, but it's kind of amazing thing. Nobody knows about this. Nobody really knows about this fantastic, odd, stitched together amenity, open space amenity that we have here in Greater Boston, but it kind of comes out of the thinking of this period and exists today. And this is the kind of development, I told you, what's the vernacular development for this kind of, these parkway suburbs. Here you are. How many houses? That's Colonial. So I live in one in Newtonville. These are all over the area, but good housing. And then private parks. We have this era of great public parks, and we know that Olmsted was trying to create these places where all the classes could mix in a democratic society, and Eliot was trying to do the same thing. But you also had, at the same time, you had wealthier people saying, geez, we like to have our own private park. And the first country club in America is in Brookline. It still is called the Country Club. It was originally set up for equestrian sports, but very quickly golf becomes popular, and by the end of the 19th century it's a golf club, and country clubs and golf clubs basically become synonymous in the early 20th century. And you do have these private places in suburbs to separate people out a bit, not to bring people together. So I like to include that. And then also coming out of this era, planning and zoning. How can I sum up the complex subjects in about a couple minutes? Zoning starts in the 1920s, but this is the precursor. It's introduced in this state. Cambridge and Arlington have zoning by 1924. You can see by 1928, 28 communities around the Boston core have zoning by 1928. But there is a precursor here. And that's because these suburbs didn't want to have what was called at the time Boston's weed, which is the 3-decker housing. This is a house that today is in Belmont. And when the Red Line wasn't called the Red Line at the time, but in 1912, when the subway from Harvard Square to Boston was opened, they were really afraid that all of Boston was going to want to come out on that subway, come out here, hop on another streetcar and go on and move into wherever, Arlington or Belmont or, you name it. So they got the state legislature to pass a bill called the Tenement House Act, saying that if a house had more than 2 units or 2.5 stories, it had to be fireproofed, couldn't be wooden. And then it was up to town to, if you adopted that, then you could prohibit that kind of housing. So that happens, and that's a precursor of zoning, probably the first example. It's kind of interesting. So then, this is the period that everybody thinks of when they think of suburbia. I'm going to kind of move through it. I think that, this is an example of big planning. The big plan was the Route 128 Beltway. Here it is, a picture of it in 1959, midday. Not too many cars out in Needham. Mustn't have been too bad of a day to be out driving. You could go right by there today. The New England Industrial Park was called at the time. The buildings have been kind of reworked a bit, but the place still exists. This is a industrial park that was opened in 1952. Cabot and Forbes, a lot of the development, really pioneered, not just here, but nationally, the whole idea of industrial parks, business parks. And if you look at it, by the end of the 1950s, almost every exit from here north along Route 128 up to Lexington and Waltham, et cetera, had some sort of business park, office park, whatever. And here's an example here. By 1960, Route 128 is called America's Technology Highway. And you can see what's happening here. You've got researchers from MIT saying, hey, Cambridge is so jammed, we can't build anything new. Let's move out to 128. Lincoln Lab opens in 1951. You've got MITRE opening later in the 50s. The Habsburg Office Park in Waltham is the second office park to be opened in America. First it was in Birmingham, Alabama, a couple years earlier. I think the steel industry was so dirty there, the executives just had to get out of downtown Birmingham. They kind of stumbled onto that. And the whole idea here, you've got these executives, have them out in the country, get them out of town, and obviously office parks have grown way beyond whatever was in Waltham in 1955. Shopping. Shoppers World, 1951. This is the second regional mall in the country. The first one was in Seattle, also the same year. This was torn down, how many years ago? Almost 20 years now. And you've got the great spaceship down here, which was a Jordan Marsh. This is 26 miles from downtown Boston. Up till then, if you wanted to go to a department store or any serious shopping, you had to go to the downtown of a central city. And this starts off the march to suburbia for retail, which ends up hollowing out the shopping in downtowns. Then commercial strips, you could say go back to the 1920s. I just noticed the Hilltop was announced last week as closing, or a couple weeks ago, a real landmark. But I can, let your imagination go on commercial strips and how those came about. The housing styles, this is wonderful. I found this at the Boston Public Library, the series of these postcards. And every Christmas, this VFW post in West Roxbury would raffle off a house. And this is really a big deal after World War II. And tens of thousands of people would come to these model homes in the fall and buy their chances. And I'm going to show you 3 different years. This is 51, the Colonial Revival model, kind of small, but that's what people were affording in 51. You've got kind of a semi-elaborate cottagey ranch type from 52. And then you've got a split level from 53. So this sums up. The only one they didn't have a postcard of was a Cape Cod house. I don't know if they ever raffled one off. That's the other kind of style from that era. So I thought this is for West Roxbury, but you could find houses like this sprinkled through Norwood and Walpole and Wilmington and Wakefield and a whole bunch of places like that. So now, and I really want to kind of bring us through to the present and leave a chance for questions. The interstate system in the United States was kind of built out by 1970. And again, the interstates are almost like the railroads. People thought it was going to be for long distance travel. When they were first built, President Eisenhower sold it as for a defense policy. But what happened was, as soon as they created it, all these nodes of development, particularly commercial development, occurred around exits. And that's what really begins to happen after 1970. And this happens across the country, not just the greater Boston. So, here we are here, development of the Westboro intersection of I-495 and the Mass Pike, and you can see that it isn't totally developed. I mean, maybe if we were in Reston, Virginia, it'd be all concrete, but there's something about New England where there still are some trees and some green space, even though you're at this intense intersection, if you will. I-495 becomes the new corridor, a new kind of development. It's a little farther out. Definitely, it's less dense. There's a housing subdivision. You can see the big lots, 1 2-acre lots instead of, I live on 1/6 of an acre in Newton, and I'm very happy with that. I'm not a lot of lawn to mow. And then here's a Walmart. This is an old picture because Walmarts aren't that small, if you've seen a Walmart. Okay, big box stores. I said I would show you different styles of retail buildings. I showed you the regional mall. Well, for this era, it's the big box store being plopped next to a interstate exit. Like mansions, these are Walpole. You can see these all over, but much bigger houses than they were living in the 1950s or 1960s. Now, as I said, I was going to talk about big plans, and some of which went somewhere and some of which didn't. There was a piece in the Globe a couple years back in the Sunday Idea section, and it was on this book that came out, Metropolis, and it was a book where they talked about economic development spinning off from big regional hub airports in places like O'Hare and Atlanta and Dallas-Fort Worth, et cetera. And those, a particular kind of economic development which could be very robust and really make a region go. And the author of this particular piece might have been Peter Canellos, who was the main writer for that, kind of said, why didn't Boston do that? And it went back to the early 1990s, and Armando and I were at Cape Cod at the time, and it doesn't show Cape Cod, but they looked at going down where the Mass Military Reservation is, and nobody wanted a second regional airport down there. And they also looked at off of Route 2 and 495 up at Fort Devens, and the neighbors didn't want that either. So it was something which might have been, if you could imagine, a big, Hartsfield Airport off at 2 and 495, which didn't happen. And the people who wrote this book kind of almost wish that it had. I think Boston's got a lot of other modes of economic development, and maybe didn't need that. If you don't like sprawl, that probably wouldn't have helped. So then I do have a piece in here, not just about suburbia, but what happens to the central city in response to this suburban flight that's happening in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's a great story. I just have a chapter on it, but I think I kind of get at the essence of it. What happens in Boston and how they reinvent American cities. In fact, one Oxford University professor a few years back wrote, if any city in the world invented the postmodern city, Boston got there first. I don't want to overplay the greatness of Boston, but Boston was really on it in the 1960s. This is the city hall that everybody wants to tear down and replace. I think maybe there are people in this room who might think it's perfectly fine. This is it. Historic preservation, one of the keys, not just here, but places across the country. Again, Boston getting there early. I love this photo of Kevin White just in love with the redevelopment of Quincy Market. Is that Ben Thompson?
Yeah, I think so.
In a younger day, it just doesn't quite look like him, but that'd be Ben Thompson on the left.
It's that unruly forelock.
Yeah, that's what gives him away. I didn't know him in the earlier years, but so it gives you a sense of what was created here, and everybody knows that this was a tremendous model that was very influential around the country, Quincy Market. And then I'm moving up to the present day, burying the Central Artery, the Rose Kennedy Greenway, what's happened to Boston. It really is this very pleasant place that people love to explore now and come from all over the region, the country, and the world to be in. I want to emphasize Kendall Square, which I will call urban for the sake of this, and the tremendous intensity of economic development and innovation that's happening there. Because I want to get us up to this particular era that we're in now and kind of kick this around a little bit. This is Cronin's Landing. This an early example of, it's the site of an old department store of, you could call it transit-oriented development, smart growth, whatever. It's got the apartments on top of the retail. This is the Charles River, just on the top of it, you've got the railroad line going into Boston. If you can make out here just over to the right, you've got Moody Street here, those brick buildings. Those are the original factories going back to 1814 and the first textile factories in America. So you've got a lot in the story. But I'm trying to put this out here to kind of think, what's the best kind of development, smart growth, transit-oriented, whatever. And this has got the mixed use of the residential and the commercial. Now, I haven't mentioned MAPC. I think Metropolitan Planning Council has done a lot of great work. I used a lot of it in putting together my book. And they did a very interesting regional plan in 2008. It's strictly advisory. When we were at the Cape Cod Commission, we got a regional plan that we got to implement. And a lot of people were kind of sore when we tried to do that, but we did it. But the interesting thing that MAPC posed in this is that between 2005 and 2030, almost 500,000 new people are projected to move to Boston, regardless of how it happens. And so how are you going to accommodate them? Where are they going to live in a region which is basically built out within 495? There are not lots of green fields where you're going to put up more houses on an acre of land or even a quarter an acre of land. So where are you going to put that? Not that other regions are looking at the same problem, but other regions around the country are all kind of dealing with how do we do future development, something that is denser and more walkable and transit oriented. Canton, and I may be wrong on this, but I think the Canton is the first community that really kind of looks at their zoning and say, we want to revitalize our downtown back in 2000. And of course they go and look at their zoning, and you can't have residential in a commercial district. You can't build the communities that were built in the 19th century with people living above retail or the sorts of communities that you have in Boston or maybe Cambridge. So they redid their zoning and allowed residential to come over retail. You see at the top, these are buildings here which all have housing above and some sort of retail, restaurants, whatever below. And again, you've got the rail line coming up here on the left and a railroad station. So that's Canton. And then immediately, I don't know if they get the idea from Canton or they figure it out on their own, communities across the region start to do that. Yes, mixed-use development is legitimate again. It happens in Framingham, in Wilmington, in Wakefield, Gloucester, you name it, they do it. Now here's an interesting example of station land in Medford, which has been around now for half a dozen years. And you see a lot of development near transit stations, but it might just be housing. This is an example, though, of one with the housing on the upper floors and retail restaurants below, and it's right near an Orange Line station. This gives you a sense of the kinds of development opportunities, the map of the MBTA commuter rail system. There are a lot of development sites near those 120, 30 stations. Now here's an example here, the Woodland station in Newton, Arbor Point Apartments. It's kind of a small site. It's got the housing, but there's no commercial there. There's no commercial nearby. It probably doesn't work. The parking wouldn't work. So is this the best? I guess I'm challenging myself and you to think, what's the optimal development? Is this okay for this particular site? It doesn't have retail. Now, I'm going to come back a bit more to transit-oriented development, but I wanted to, again, go back to retail. I showed how that evolved through different eras, and now we've got a rejection of the enclosed regional mall and the emergence of the lifestyle center, the outdoor, pseudo-urban townscape. But that's what people want. People want to be in downtowns. They don't want to be in an enclosed mall that just is shopping. If you think, let's say, the food services in the regional mall of the 60s and 70s, you might have a Friendly's, you might have a really mediocre food court. Now you go to these lifestyle centers, and they have nice restaurants. This has got a Davio's, it also has a Shake Shack, but it's, you know, all these lifestyle centers which are now proliferating. Nobody's building enclosed malls either here or anywhere in the country. They're building these townscape centers. And I love this here. This is in Chestnut Hill, kind of in the Brookline Needham line. It's called the Street. Like, you know, there are a million streets in Newton. I always call it the Street. I mean, we can find streets. We don't have to go to this mall to find the street. So, but then what else is happening? There are these tremendous big projects, and I'm talking about, again, the vernacular template. Does it all have to be done? I'm going to show you a couple really enormous projects. There's Northpoint in Cambridge. It was stopped. It was these buildings, you can look on the left, these were built before the economic collapse in 2008. It's getting revived. It's a $2 billion project. You know, they're looking at 2,000 something units of housing, 1 million square feet of office and research space, kind of a spin-off area from Kendall Square. You look at the photo on the left, you can see Kendall Square in the distance. This is a logical spin-off from Kendall Square. It's right near the Lechmere station, which is being rebuilt. This is an example, but it's, you know, a couple $2 billion. You just can't be a local tradesman who's going to put up a couple 2 or 3 family houses and kind of play part of the game. Does it all have to be big capital to pull this off? I don't know. Here's another example, Assembly Square. Check it out. They're putting it up today. It's going to be really opening a lot of it next year. You can see the Orange Line station. They're building a new station there, which is supposed to open next year. This is just across the river, the Mystic River, from Station Landing in Medford. And again, this is one of these, 1 billion projects. 500,000 square feet of retail, almost a couple million square feet of office and office space and research. Again, this is trying to pull off and play off what's happening in Cambridge. Open space along here. So it kind of gives you a sense of what's happening. Same thing is happening in downtown Quincy, and that's getting underway. So I'm going to close with some questions which I'm trying to think about and you might think about as well. This is smart growth. We're kind of into this era now. It seems to be, I wouldn't be making this presentation 10 or 15 years ago. It's kind of taken a while to kind of get us into this era, and I think we know that various issues with the environment and transportation, just changing tastes are here. But if you go to the MAPC's Metro Future Plan, it has a smart growth scenario, which is basically to develop where you already have development, existing town centers, redevelop the strip, et cetera, but it's voluntary. How do you get communities to carry it out? Right now, you've got to rely on individual communities to do rezoning. I don't know how many have done really systematic rezoning. I don't think many have. And it's kind of a project by project basis. It's like hand-to-hand combat to do this sort of development. Now, for instance, I said I lived in Newtonville. There's a proposal right now to, on a little, it's by the Star Market, there's a little municipal parking lot there, and the city put out for bids for development for some sort of mixed-use development. And bids came in, and there are some plans for it, but there are people who are against it. There's a candidate for alderman in my ward, and I was just reading her campaign literature the other day. She's against it for traffic and all that. But there's this kind of line in there in bold that says, we want to preserve our village for the people who, quote, already live here. So it's like, they're doing this in Newtonville? That's kind of an urbane place. This isn't kind of some place out in the suburbs that thinks it's some green, pristine place. But people, this is this NIMBYism. And I know that Anthony's always working on great new books, and I don't know if he's ever, maybe he kind of wrote it already, but like the history of NIMBYism, kind of like really dope it out, can Boston do the development that it needs to do kind of with NIMBYism and hand-to-hand combat? It's got a lot of stuff going. Maybe you just kind of build it where they'll accept it and maybe come back to some other place later on. I don't know. Can the state do more, either through state policies? I'm going to throw out just a couple things to really kind of push smart growth in TOD. I've been working kind of hopelessly or helplessly, and I know Carol Thomas is here on zone reform for a number of years, and we've got a bill. This year it's just called House 1859, and it's got a section in there, if communities zone for denser development, housing development, they get extra goodies. They can charge impact fees for a wider range of infrastructure needs. They can do development agreements. They can get some they can reduce grandfathering on zoning from 8 years to 3 if they do zoning for 5% of whatever their housing stock is. So let's say if they have 1,000 units of housing in their town and they create housing for 50 units, and if it's either 4 single-family homes to an acre, if it's going to be 2 or 3 family homes, it's 8 to an acre, or multifamily homes 12 to an acre. So if you kind of meet those thresholds, you get more goodies. Now, who knows if we'll ever get this bill passed, but is this enough? I don't know. Mass Housing Partnership wants to put in the bill, require every town to have multifamily housing unless they're stuck on Title V and don't have proper sewer. Right now, they aren't forced to do that. I know that the Pioneer Institute a couple years ago was proposing an idea saying, by right, forget about towns rezoning, by right, every community should be able to have residential mixed use within a quarter mile of any subway or commuter rail station. I don't know, could we ever get that through? Would that make a difference? I don't know. But those are the best ideas. I don't know if there are others. And then just a few other things. Expanded transit. I see the governor's still talking about it. The state legislature has put some funding in. It's basically to maintain the system and better repair that we have. It doesn't expand it. Everybody that I talk to who's thinking about future development and planning says we need more, better transit. I saw the governor is still pushing the South Coast Rail going down to New Bedford and Fall River. Great. But I think that expanding service inside Route 128 is really critical, whether it's finishing that green line up to Somerville to Medford, doing other things like that, rethinking the urban ring, a great idea that was on the table 12 or 15 years ago, which was taken away a number of years ago with the bad economy. But just getting better transit, because if you're going to get these tens of thousands of new units, and Mayor Menino wants to have 30,000 new ones in Boston in another 6 or 8 years, we've got to have better transit. Another idea that's come to me is emphasis on town planning for suburbs. I was just in the Netherlands, and if you go to Europe, Netherlands or England or whatever, the concept is town planning. And it can be for cities or whatever, but we don't use that term in this country. It's usually city planning, maybe regional planning. And I don't think the suburbs of this region have really thought in terms of townscapes and what they should be. I mentioned the Newtonville project. They had one parking lot, let's get a proposal. But they didn't do a plan for Newtonville thinking we could add more units here or we could take down. It just wasn't within a context of a real plan for Newtonville. And I think that might have been part of its weakness. And then finally, just emphasis on redeveloping highway strips and corridors. It's kind of being done piecemeal. I don't think we've really thought it through here well at all. Northern Virginia has. They've got some great stuff down around Alexandria and Arlington, but I think we really could do a lot on that here. So I'm going to just finish up. Here we show this mosaic, this incredible mosaic inside 495. And just close out with just a couple factoids about Greater Boston, kind of away from the planning. You can believe these or not. I mean, all you have to do is go on Yahoo, Huffington Post every day, and they've got the 10 biggest or best or whatever. But these are from legitimate sources. I can guarantee you they're footnoted in my book. Get this, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey of global metropolitan areas. And Tokyo's #1, and York's #2, and London's #3. Boston has the 11th largest GDP of metro areas in the world. I don't know. Armando, you're a skeptic, you tell me. The Economist magazine, very legitimate, ranks Boston #10 in competitiveness globally. I mean, I thought Massachusetts was supposed to have a bad business climate, Can't be that bad. And then another group was ranking innovation. I remember I was coming across this, innovation, what are the leading cities for innovation in the world? I don't know if Boston. I thought the Silicon Valley was pretty high up there. But they had Boston ranked #1. Now, Boston got lots of problems. I've kind of mentioned it. Anybody who lives here knows about it. It's kind of one of our intramural sports, debating, what's wrong with Boston. But it's got a lot to build upon. And it's kind of fun doing the planning that I know that we're all working on here. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. And if you have time for questions, I'd love to entertain them.
There's a section in the book you didn't talk about on modernism in the Boston region, and I'm pretty much interested in that anyway, but I thought it's kind of it's a teaser I'd like you to say more about. And there was a time when we had some of the great modernist architects come to Cambridge, and they became kind of suburban in their practice in some ways, in places like Lexington and Lincoln and so forth.
Right.
The famous Gropius House in Lincoln and the houses in Lexington that the architects collaborative put together and so forth. But and we know we have a few on Cape Cod that managed to escape as well, and Wellfleet. So, but could you comment a little bit, because Boston isn't known for this. I mean, Southern California maybe, but this is something, and I think Cambridge was a piece of it in a sense.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because these are examples which Armando mentioned of classic 1950s really, suburbia, which is not urban. This is the suburban dream that people like Ben Thompson, who was in the 1970s bringing back the city, was creating these subdivisions and they're all over, especially east of Cambridge, and off of Route 128. So the people who were working in these office parks were living in these modern suburban places, which were not mixed use, which were not transit oriented, and kind of what we're moving away from today. But then you also had the modernism in the cities, Cambridge and Boston, which I think are, well, whether they work or not, we can talk about the City Hall Plaza, but they are the building blocks of the new city that we have today. But if you have anything more to say.
No, I just, I think it's, it's a sort of a curiosity in a way, but certainly one of the assets that we have, and historical by this point. All right, let's open it up, and yes.
Can you talk about the current era and the role of universities, hospital campuses as urban generators?
Yeah, absolutely. And I made that little comment there about if any city stumbled upon the recipe for the postmodern city or post-industrial city, it was Boston. And every city in the world is talking about how do we, I mean, other places are trying to emulate the Silicon Valley, but other places are trying to emulate Boston. And with the education and the hospitals which we have, which have created a tremendous, landscape in Boston and Cambridge, and that's what really dominates, and that's what has really held those places together. I know we've got people here from throughout the Boston area. I haven't seen too much of the Boston area, but I am involved with the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, and if you talk to Tim Brennan, their director out there, they've run into a lot of that, trying to do a regional plan in the Pioneer Valley, the Connecticut Valley. Especially from the more urbanized communities, the less interest there is in that, the more openness there is to planning, but the more rural the communities, the more concern there is about property rights. But to my mind, that's ultimately where maybe the least new development will take place, so that maybe they have the least to worry about. Because I think the major developments will still be concentrated where we've already had development. It's just reconfigured or made denser. I was in Waltham speaking a couple weeks ago, and Waltham is trying to figure out what to do, and they're thinking, well, maybe we've got to take a leaf from Quincy's page. So that's, I think within Route 28, 128, and the more traditional cities, there's much more openness to that.
You know, one of the reasons people care about property rights is property value, and most of the things that Jim has been talking about, I think, would enhance property values. They're likely to have a very favorable effect on property rights. That's not always recognized. So we have time for a last, anybody?
The influence of working class and poor people neighborhoods and how they occupy land and how they actually influence decision making. Because most of your driving forces were basically big events, big things, rich people and stuff, and I just wonder what the story is.
Yeah, I didn't really talk as much about the cities, and I've been thinking about that people who are not so wealthy tend to live in the cities. And whether they were living there in the 50s, 60s, and 70s or today, and that's what the concentrations of people are in the cities. And of course there are disputes, battles, tensions within the cities. I know that on the new Indigo line, which is being built on the Fairmount line going to Boston, even in that area, neighbors are concerned about gentrification and new development taking place. You think that they might be welcoming new development, but there's concerns that it might push them out and that they're resisting in terms of planning, too much new development. So it's interesting that that's happening there as well. I haven't really talked that much in this presentation. I've been talking more about suburbanization. That's how I see it anyways. It's more of an urban issue. Maybe we would call it more neighborhood planning here, but I think it should be, no, Armando, you're really doing this on a full-time basis. Mm-hmm. Would you recommend anything in terms of townscape planning or books or whatever?
I've already been scarred in Arlington, as Dan will probably remember, talking about density in a place that thinks it's already too dense. But yeah, I mean, obviously one has to work in the community with the community to get acceptance of this. And one of our themes here at the Institute has been that people have reactions to the concept of density not based on real experience. And if you can help them to kind of better understand how density works, You know, we even go so far as to say there is something called good density that is better than a lower density might be, both because it supports the kinds of amenities and infrastructure that people want, but also because it works better in terms of quality of life. So it's a tricky thing, and I know Anna has experienced some of the stresses of bringing these ideas to Arlington, but I think even Arlington could probably accommodate more people in a very happy way, but I'm not saying that in Arlington. So.
Okay.
All right, well, Jim's going to be here for a while. There are books in the back. Thanks again, Jim.
Okay, thank you.